fail.
Order.
What the fail? Pag hindi mo na talaga fail. O like, ina ko yung fail.
Government.
Government. Yes, you called us.
Oh. Position. Order.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's on record, man.
Hello, very.
Close this debate. Second speaker from the opposition.
Without waiting for me.
In this debate, opposition bench have cited two major assumptions coming from government bench. Number one is that sex education is foolproof, that it's so effective once we integrate it in these Catholic or religious schools that automatically people will abstain. But that's an obvious assumption. Because they completely fail to, truly grind the whole idea and the whole principle behind sex education. Because when we talk about sex education, we're not just talking about people who are telling us why, how sex could actually damage our lives, or how it could actually affect our lives in the latter part. However, what sex education does, that it tells us alternatives on how we can actually enjoy sex without feeling its harms and its consequences, and something which we feel is totally contradictory to their argument on fear. Second assumption coming from government bench, they talk about they assume that fear and collective effort is mutually exclusive under their model, which is why we believe that under our policy, there will still be collective effort. However, it will be backed up by morals and principles, because we believe that in these institutions, in these educational institutions, there is a need for moral standards to be flourished. And how do we do that? We back it up through our educational system, which is why if we put sex education, we're going to back it up with moral standards, which is why our policy tells us that once abstinence programs actually fail, then there's a need for, then our only proper course of action would be to allow sex education to flourish. How is that so hard to comprehend? Second assumption comes from their side of the house. They talk about fear and how at the end of the day, once we actually go with their policy, we're actually scaring people off into doing something right, because we're telling them that these are the consequences, therefore do not have sex. Then if that's the case, we're not talking about sex education, we're talking about abstinence programs. That's basically our policy. When you talk about sex education, it teaches you safer means of having sex, which means these people will no longer encounter the consequences once they actually engage in sexual intercourse. They believe that they are invincible against these STDs, that they could actually have sex with absolutely anyone without being rendered vulnerable from the effects of these, from the consequences of these sexual intercourse. Before that, yes, Lord.
Sex education includes all types of birth control, which includes abstinence. Secondly, confusion. A miracle house you forward in confusion. If your main problem is confusion in this debate, you're confused with math. Should we take it off our curriculum just because you're confused? Think about sex education, how effective it is for society.
Clearly, that's an isolated case, because we're not talking about, when we talk about his very ridiculous parallel, when we're talking about math, then it's inherently confusing. When we talk about sex education in a Bible Belt community, then you're fighting against two very different standards, two very different moral standards. We can fight against, we can actually bicker upon moral standards and bicker upon pragmatic standards when we talk about sex education. Silence, please. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that that's a very isolated case, and that should not be included in, that their rebuttal should not fly in this debate. Second, third point of rebuttal, let's talk about how integrating, under policy and integration of religious values in sex education. We believe that how our policy actually differs from theirs is that we believe in abstinence program. However, if it actually fails, then our only proper course of action would be to reinforce sex education. However, their policy is very different, because they want to merge these two very different moral standards, which then leads into confusion and impedes upon the rationality of these people. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that in this debate, we have what we call policies tailor-fit for certain moral standards. We cannot have one policy for absolutely everyone, which is why when we talk about Africa, we're talking about different standards in particular when we talk about different states, or in this case, in different institutions. If we cannot actually come into a unified effort coming from all sectors when it comes to abstinence or sex education, then why can't we allow sex education to flourish in government-funded social units rather than educational institutions? Because other follow one unified moral standard that comes to a certain particular religion. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that if sex education in particular when we talk about elementary and when we talk about high school is so direly needed, why don't we insert sex education in math clinic? Why don't we insert sex education in Sili Escuela if that's so direly needed? Why must we put it in schools instead? We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the proper agents to actually teach their students these youth to teach the youth on why we actually need to abstain or why we actually need to engage in safer sex. It is their parents. So what we do is we enforce sex education in government-funded social units to educate their parents, to educate the people who actually has to be educated and who actually are biologically designed to have sex at that certain age. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that as time goes by, that it becomes their responsibility to pass it on to their children and tell their children that, hey, you must abstain. If you can't be safe, then if you can't be good, then be safe. If you can't be safe, then leave it after me. For that.
Okay, my main problem with your guys' case is contradictory. I have given here and said let's have it optional for schools to implement it. Now you're saying let's have government programs or government units implemented in society. So what do you guys really want? To implement it in schools when you say it's useless? Or do you put it in government units?
We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the two policies actually fly. Because why can these two policies of ours actually work hand in hand? We believe that on the first note, that if you actually enforce these abstinence programs in schools, then it actually fails. Then we have our alternatives. We can either enforce it in schools or either enforce it in social government units. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a subjectivity of judgment. We cannot just enforce one policy among all. Silence, shut up, please. We believe that we cannot just enforce one policy among all educational institutions. So what we do, we have alternatives. We have plan A, we have plan B, we have plan C. So what we do, if abstinence program actually fails, then we can actually enforce it either in school or in government social units. How is that so hard to comprehend? I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that if you actually enforce it in both these educational institutions and in government social unit, then we're also promoting collective effort coming from all sectors in society. Because we believe that we do not believe in their policy when they tell us that it's theoretically impossible for us to protect the vulnerable sector in society, the victims in this scenario, which are the student, which are the youth, which are the people who are actually vulnerable to STDs. We believe that if that's the case, then there's a need for us to enforce it in government-funded social units. But if it actually fails, then there's still plan C. You can still enforce it in educational institutions. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 5 seconds.